This is Kristen Hovet, and you are listening to Humans of Earth, the podcast that seeks to make the world smaller through shared stories of ourselves and what matters to us.
The process of reclamation and healing from complex trauma requires tremendous courage. It was a matter of saving my life. These were my angels.
Welcome to the 11th episode of Humans of Earth. Today I'm speaking with Sheri Heller, a 55-year-old psychotherapist and interfaith minister from New York.
Hi, Kristen. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Thanks for talking with me.
My pleasure.
I got in touch with Sheri when I was doing an article for Genetic Literacy Project on adverse childhood experiences and their effects on adult health and well-being. Sheri wrote to me saying that she had an ACE score of 9 out of a possible 10, which is a very unique score and how high it is. So just thinking about that score of 9 is mind-blowing to me, how much Sheri's been through, how difficult her life has been, and how much it has taken her to get to where she is, in a place where she can give back to society and to her community. It's incredibly difficult to listen to her story, but also incredibly inspiring. To give a background on some of the language we use in this interview, which is adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs, I will read straight from Wikipedia as it gives a great overview. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, aka the ACE study, was a research study conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So participants were recruited to the study between 1995 and 1997, and they've been in long-term follow-up for health outcomes. The study has demonstrated an association of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, with health and social problems as an adult. So this may be very obvious to most people. If you had a really difficult childhood, it makes sense on an intuitive level that yes, you might have more problems later in life. But I don't think it's obvious to everyone, and I think a lot of people are in a state of denial about just how bad the outcome can be. I've read that people with high ACE scores can live about 20 years less than the average person. To me, that's huge. And that means this is one of the most important health issues of our time. The study was headed by Vincent Felitti, head of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego. So Felitti and his team looked at physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, witnessing a mother being treated violently, being a child in a household where there was substance abuse and mental illness. They also looked at parental separation or divorce, and whether or not a household member had been incarcerated. About 2/3 of individuals in that first initial ACEs study reported at least one adverse childhood experience. The number of ACEs was strongly associated with adult high-risk health behaviors such as smoking, alcohol, and drug abuse, promiscuity, and severe obesity, and correlated with ill health including depression, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, and in general, a shortened lifespan. So if you look at these outcomes, these are pretty much, we're dealing with the leading causes of death. Compared to an ACE score of 0, having 4 adverse childhood experiences was associated with a 7-fold increase in alcoholism, a doubling of risk of being diagnosed with cancer, and a 4-fold increase in emphysema. An ACE score above 6 was associated with a 30-fold, that's 300% increase in attempted suicide. The ACE study's result suggests that maltreatment and household dysfunction in childhood contribute to health problems decades later. These include chronic diseases such as heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. These are the most common causes of death and disability in the United States. The study's findings, while relating to a specific population within the U.S., might be assumed to reflect similar trends in other parts of the world, according to the World Health Organization. Subsequent studies have confirmed the high frequency of adverse childhood experiences or found even higher incidence in urban or youth populations. That being said, The research clearly shows that adverse childhood experiences are not just taking place in poor populations. They touch everyone. Adverse childhood experiences do not discriminate. The original study questions have been used to develop a 10-item screening questionnaire that takes under a minute to complete. I've included a link to the questionnaire in this episode's show notes. You can also find the questionnaire by going to Google and searching NPR ACEs quiz. Okay, back to the show. How would you describe your hometown or where you grew up?
That's a complex question because I was born in Bronzeville and as an infant lived for, I guess, the first 2 to 3 years of my life in Queens, and that was probably the most traumatic time of my childhood. So it's difficult for me to talk nostalgically, about the environment. My mother actually kept us hostage in the house. I know this is supposed to be the light part, of the interview, but that was really probably in my formative years, it was the most profoundly traumatic because I actually almost died during that period. Both my sister and I were malnourished. My mother was floridly psychotic, and she kept us hostage for long periods of time in the house. And we lived in complete squalor. Sometimes my sister and I would escape, and I remember a playground nearby, but I was very traumatized. I was a selective mute. I was pretty much in shock, so I wasn't socialized. So I remember trying to approach kids in the playground, which was very difficult. My sister did have some friends. She's 7 years older than I, so there were some people in the neighborhood that she connected to. I remember one of her friends had sea turtles, a huge tank. I remember that because that was very captivating.
So was it just your sister and your mom?
Yes, and my father was sort of peripherally in the picture. They were married, but there was tremendous... my mother was very violent with him, so I remember he came to the house and it crescendoed into a violent situation. Eventually, he had her what's called 2PC'd. 2 psychiatrists came to hospitalize her. We were sleeping in a park at that point. She thought the house was on fire because she saw a sign that said there was a fire sale. So I do remember that. I remember being in the park and us being approached. And that's when my sister and I, we were going to be wards of state, but my father's side of the family intervened. And that's when I lived with my grandmother and grandfather, and my sister moved in with an aunt and uncle.
And how old were you?
I was going on 4 at that point, between 3 and 4.
And were they nearby?
They were, so my sister and I were able to see each other, which was very important because she was really my primary bond, and I think without each other, I don't know if we could have survived. We had pretty consistent visitations with each other, and I got to know my cousins. I started healing, so I was very close with my grandmother, and my mother was hospitalized for a pretty extensive period of time. But then when she was discharged, my mother and father, my father was not healthy either, they created this whole fictional narrative that somehow we would live as a happy family. And so then I left my grandmother to return to my parents, and that became very bad, quickly decompensated into a very bad situation.
And your sister as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we all resumed living together. She and I, actually, as we got older, we both used drugs and alcohol to medicate. We also both, ironically, loved the arts. Both my parents painted. They were both artists. Later on, I had inclinations to study acting, even as a child. I think the arts were such a source of respite for both my sister and I. We always had music, books. I remember writing very young, reading voraciously as a child. My sister played piano. She had a facility with languages. So intellectually, there was a lot of stimulation, and creatively. So it was a weird juxtaposition.
Were you going to like a normal public school at this time, like throughout your childhood?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
I started out when I lived with my grandmother. She had me in a nursery school. My grandparents were Orthodox Jews. They came from Russia to escape the pogroms. I went to shul with her a lot, and she had me in a nursery school that was kind of faith-driven, that was Orthodox. They were very kind to me. I was very sick during that period. I was malnourished. I had a lot of physical problems, and I was mentally ill. so there were a lot of concessions made. And then when I went into mainstream school, it was a bit more challenging. But I had some very kind teachers. I remember kindergarten, I remember first grade. It was hard because I really was not socialized, so it was a very challenging time.
Do you live in the same area now?
I do live in Brooklyn, but not in the same area. I live in an area that I think is more resonant with my personality, with who I am. I was living in a much more traditional kind of neighborhood growing up, and I live in a much more diverse neighborhood now. The area I was in was predominantly, really largely a Jewish community. There are a lot of religious Jews that live there, although I wasn't. My father was a glorified atheist. We weren't religious at all, and I'm still not a religious person, even though I'm a spiritual person, and I actually went to seminary, but I don't ascribe to a specific religion. But I did stay in Brooklyn, which is interesting because I'm actually a dual citizen. My mother was Canadian. I eventually hope to move to Montreal.
Oh, nice.
So I'm applying. Yes, I love Montreal, but I managed to stay in Brooklyn, even though I love to travel. That's a big thing for me.
So you're a therapist and interfaith minister. What
Yes.
does a typical day look like for you?
It depends on the day. Usually I do individual therapy, so I see predominantly people with histories of complex trauma who also struggle with addictive disorders. I work a lot with process addictions, so it depends on the day. I may see sometimes 2 people will come in, sometimes I'll have, 7 people coming in for sessions. I love to work with artists. I tend to draw a population of very creative people. I do an artist support group. So on Sundays, that's something that is in the schedule twice a month. And the exploration is psychodynamic. We go very deep. I deal with people who come from histories of complex trauma rooted in child abuse. Some are first-generation Holocaust survivors. A lot of people who are dealing with ambient abuse, cluster B parents, where there was character pathology, psychopathology. So there are a lot of dissociative disorders that I'm working with, a lot of sexual abuse trauma. So it's intense. My clients are pretty high functioning, and I'm really moving in the direction of thriving at this point and incorporating more life-affirming pursuits into the work, because I think that's integral to recovery.
How would you say that you self-care? Obviously, you hear a lot of difficult stories. I'd imagine that some of those are triggering for you as well. So what are some things that you do to cope and practice self-care?
My own therapy, and I started therapy as a teenager. To me, therapy is like a contemporary spiritual path. So that's an integral part of my life. And I work actually with a drama therapist, which I really love. My partner is a musician, so I love listening to him play music. That really elevates me, and it completely takes me out of work, and basically the arts, writing, being with friends. I studied Kung Fu for a while, yoga. Body work is very important. Staying healthy, I work with a naturopath. My self-care is critical. I keep my world very calm, and I carve out a lot of time to restore myself.
You have an A score of 9, and that's out of a possible 10. So from my understanding, this score is both very high, and it's also quite rare in the general population.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know how you went from such a difficult childhood to struggling with addictions and complex trauma to then becoming someone who you say is thriving, not only surviving, and also to giving back in such a meaningful way to your community and to those around you. I'm wondering if you can walk me through this journey.
The journey has been very daunting and painful and has spanned a trajectory of over 3 decades. So I want to really be clear that the process of reclamation and healing from complex trauma requires tremendous courage and devotion. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college and graduate school, to put myself through therapy. It was a matter of saving my life, and I knew that. But there was a lot of acting out. I felt extremely fragmented from the maternal deprivation, the ruptures and bonding, and I had to really persevere. Sometimes I look back and I wonder how I stayed the course, because it was very bleak. But what I know I did, and what I also talk about with my clients, is I took a lot of radical action. I did everything and anything I could, no matter how ludicrous it seemed, from getting involved in Wicca to doing rebirthing to traveling to Brazil or to Italy to go to a yoga retreat or to an ashram. Whatever it was that I could do, I did. And I really believe that ultimately crescendoed in my finding a place of relative peace. When I went into seminary in 2004, at that point, I felt like I was organically led towards spiritual exploration and knew that I wanted to do a kind of a therapeutic theater project. And that was a very important part of my healing and my growth. And I believe that every step that I took along the way led me to that place. But it's also very convoluted. It's not linear. I mean, the work I did with one therapist, my first therapist I worked with for a decade, and then another, a Jungian analyst I worked with for over 12 years, involved repetitive excavating of heinous memories, which often led to decompensation. There was a lot of acting out. I struggled relationally with very severe relational trauma. I don't want to be anecdotal. I want to really press the point that I understand when I work with clients who struggle with these kinds of history, what they're up against. Often it's very difficult to be hopeful, especially when you're in chronic pain. But I think what it comes down to is the resiliency of the human spirit, connecting through humanity. I think doing this work, particularly I started volunteering at 18, working at a Bridge, which is a facility that works with homeless schizophrenics. Connecting in that way, I think, also sustained me tremendously. The arts sustained me. Finding things that keep one afloat, that keep one inspired. Travel. I started traveling at a very young age.
What are some of the places that you went to early on?
Early on at 15, I traveled to Israel and backpacked through Israel. It's a kind of wonky story the way I got there. I was actually scholarshiped to stay at a yeshiva, and I kind of talked a rabbi into scholarshiping me because I really wanted to get away from my family. Once I got there, they kicked me out for being irreverent after 2 weeks, which I was. And I stayed there for 2 months, slept on beaches, stayed at kibbutzes. Just that, I think, became the impetus for me to see the world. And that also is extremely restorative. That became an elixir for me. I have a huge bucket list. There's so much to see, and it reminded me that there's beauty and that there's a part of the world and things, abstractions that I can attach to that take me out of that darkness that I was in.
I'm wondering, actually, this wasn't one of my questions, but it's something that you said made me think of it. I have a ACE score of 6, so mine is higher than a lot of people's as well. And I understand what you say about it being difficult to find hope and beauty in the world when you're right in the midst of all of this, trauma memory, and sometimes your body's remembering and you can't quite access it cognitively. And I found one thing that was difficult. It seems trendy, this positive psychology trend, yes. Like just be happy, just smile, just, give yourself positive affirmations. And seriously, I was like, fuck that.
Yeah. Fuck that is right.
Yeah. And so...
Yeah, there are neurological realities here.
Yeah.
I mean, the limbic system is activated. Mm-hmm. You can't just anecdotally chant that away. You could do grounding. I mean, I work on grounding a lot with my clients using essential oils, biting a lemon, anything sensorial to get them back in the body, but it's very difficult. Yes, I feel the same way. I feel that way, too, about using spirituality. I think one has to be really careful with the application because you can't necessarily ascribe metaphysical teachings, on a literal level, and people often do, especially when they talk about the ego, and that makes me mad because the metaphysical description of ego is not the same as the psychoanalytic description of ego. And people confuse as if ego is bad. It's like, no, if you don't have ego, you're not in reality. You need an arbiter. Of what's going on. You have to be able to discern what is real. We need the ego. And the idea of non-attachment, it's like, well, this is our biological inheritance. We attach. Yes, I think that there is often a distortion of certain teachings, metaphysical, spiritual teachings, positive psychology. It becomes very one-dimensional. and often re-traumatizing to people.
Because we're often the ones, like I know from my own experience, it's like if you live in a world that values, especially for women, being very happy, very cheery, outgoing, it's like you do everything in your power to push those dark things down and away. So if you're being told, like, just be happy, just give yourself positive affirmation, and I mean, that serves as a repressive element to just keep those things in, which has always concerned me and worries me, actually, when I see how common and how popular, positive psych has become.
Yes, that's a great point, particularly for women, because when I started the Sister Tribe project, the theater project I alluded to, I created a one-day workshop for women with histories of complex trauma, and the predominant theme was liberating oneself from oppression through accessing aggression, something which we're acculturated to deny and be ashamed of. And I was encouraged by a book I read, Meeting the Mad Woman, by Dr. Leonard, brilliant book, and I thought I have to do something tangible with this and work with these archetypes, the whore, the shrew, the visionary, the bitch, all these pejorative terms that actually are archetypes of liberation if they're used constructively. And it's great. And I always encourage the women I work with to really transform the rage into power. Mm-hmm. Men, too. I mean, I think for women it's a more complicated task in certain ways.
And would that be linked to exploring the shadow side? Is that in there as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what we deem as the shadow, the repugnant parts of the self are really the parts that need the most integration, assimilation, and have so much wisdom.
You mentioned also, I just wanted to go back for a second, you mentioned the spiritual definition of the ego. How would you define that for listeners?
So the spiritual definition really refers to the false self, or the self in more kind of fall redemption terms, the sinful self. And that's, in psychoanalysis, the ego is really, the mediator between the id and the superego, morality and the pleasure principle. So it's a very critical part of our personality construct, and so we have to be careful the way we use terminology.
Definitely, yeah. I'm studying yoga philosophy right now, and in some texts, it treats it as something we want to silence. We want to silence the ego. But I know for some people that can create this sort of, they can almost have psychotic breaks sometimes if they go far enough into it.
Yeah. And I have referenced that a lot too with clients who explore meditation, because in order to let go, you have to have a formative self to let go of. If someone is too fragile, they can, as you are sharing, could fragment and really decompensate.
How would you define decompensate?
When I think of decompensation, it could or doesn't necessarily have to involve psychotic features, but generally there is an exacerbation of emotional memory that lives in the body, or actual memory. There can be actual flashbacks, although those are not as common as emotional memory or visceral memory. And with that can come severe deterioration, paralyzing anxiety, paralyzing depression, projections that take over, which is part of the trauma. Depending on the level of deterioration, a person may need hospitalization or may need a higher level of care to be able to kind of reintegrate.
Would dissociation be part of that as well?
Yeah, dissociation is necessary to survival. People often mistake dissociation for psychosis, and it's not. There can be dissociative psychotic symptoms. I've had some clients who've demonstrated the most bizarre symptoms with energy when they're dissociating. It's almost as if they open up a portal where they are experiencing sensations and become attuned to things beyond the self. But the dissociation is a defense against very severe fragmentation and psychosis. So often in very extreme cases, people can dissociate into alters and develop dissociative identity. That is very challenging to reintegrate, to really utilize the host, to integrate the parts.
And sometimes the parts aren't as individual, they're not as separated. Like sometimes it's just a more mild form of having different states, right?
It can be, yeah. For some people, they actually will come in and out of very more fully formed identities. But I think with all complex trauma, there is a vacillation between different states and different parts. And I think integrating those parts is fundamental to cultivating a sense of cohesive identity, really knowing who you are, because we're complex, we're comprised of so many facets.
And how would you define like the difference between having different self states versus just having mood swings or something like that? Like, I know some people will refuse that there's such thing as dissociation or those types of identity disorders. So how would you say it's different from just normal oscillating between various moods throughout the day, let's say?
Self states often involve spontaneous age regressions. So it's important to check in and see how old one feels, which is very different than vacillating with mood. You may vacillate with mood but still feel like you are developmentally an adult. But often self-states, they take on different age. Sometimes the voice may change, the experience of being in one's body. I think that there is really a shift in terms of how one experiences oneself and how one relates to the world, which is true with mood shifts as well. But I think it's much more pronounced with dissociative shifts.
And it can come with amnesia as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, often it does. That was one of my first experiences when I was studying hypnosis, and I worked with a young woman who had very severe trauma, but she had a lot of amnesic blocks. And when we did trance work, she would communicate through ideomotor signaling, which is using your hand to convey yes or no, basically, or I would ask questions, because sometimes one is either pre-verbal when they're going through the trauma, or they're mute, they're in shock. So she communicated very severe trauma, and then she came out in complete amnesia. Wow. She thought she fell asleep. She ended up having parts. She had DID and was extremely courageous and so committed to her healing, really brave.
Going back to your own experience, could you think of a few people that acted as guides for you along the way?
Definitely my therapists. I was really fortunate to find some wonderful people. Teachers. I even remember a teacher when I really started acting out in high school. I was 15 and I was raped. I was using drugs. I was out till 4 a.m, and I started really acting out, and my drug use escalated. And there was a teacher who approached me, and he was very instrumental in getting a group of other teachers together to speak to the principal of the high school that I went to help me graduate early. He became privy to my situation. He asked me to speak with a guidance counselor. So he was definitely a very loving guide, very caring human being. Yeah, I'd say teachers. I had a friend's mother who used to take me to the ballet all the time. She would get seasons tickets, and I have a really deep appreciation for dance. And so I got to see the American Ballet Company, the Joffrey, Balanchine ballets, Jules. I remember seeing that at Lincoln Center and with my friend, and we were crying. It was so moving and beautiful. And I couch surfed. I had friends who allowed me to stay in their home, their parents who allowed me to stay at their home, knowing what my situation was. These were, my angels.
And you wrote a book called A Clinician's Journey from Complex Trauma to Thriving. When did you write that?
So that's a compilation of essays and articles that I've written over the years, and I decided to pull it together into a book, and it was published in August. I self-published it, and I'm promoting it now, and I am promoting it for free for the month of November. I really want to share it with survivors and clinicians who specialize in treating trauma and addictive disorders, and hope that it sends a message of hope and recovery.
I'm wondering, I think you mentioned that you really liked reading as a child. What are some of the books that you recall from when you were a child and teen?
I loved fairy tales. I remember having the Violet Fairy book, and I couldn't stop reading it. I voraciously read. I remember reading Camelot, and I loved it, The Once and Future King. I loved fantasy. I loved fairy tales. Alice in Wonderland was one of my favorites. Then I started reading Joyce Carol Oates and John Irving. I loved Dostoevsky, especially given my Russian lineage. One of my favorite pieces that he wrote was A Dream of a Ridiculous Man. I loved Eugene O'Neill. A lot of the reading I did was kind of dark, but also beautiful, and I think very profound, linked me to humanity through these characters. Fairy tales always stayed with me, and that was integral to the theater project. I love mythology. I remember reading Greek mythology, reading about the Hindu pantheon, and because to me it's like active imagination, and I love that. It's like a repository of wisdom. It's the whole blueprint of the human condition in these stories.
Do you still read a lot today?
I do. I wish I read more. So lately I feel like for the sake of levity, I actually try to read things that really kind of take me out of the zone of therapy.
And you had discussed travel a few times already, so obviously that's very important to you. What are some of the last places that you traveled to?
Well, I just got back from Turin, Italy, and this year I also traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, which I loved. It was amazing. I generally go to Montreal pretty frequently, and so I also went to Montreal this year, went to Helsinki last year in Finland. I really have an affinity for Scandinavia. I also love Morocco. I want to go back to Morocco. I did a trip to Morocco that was just amazing. And I love Spain. I love southern Spain. I want to go to Galicia. I've done the southern coast, which is absolutely magnificent. I have a lot on the bucket list. I want to go to New Zealand. I want to do the Siberian Express through China and Russia. I want to go to Isle of Man. I haven't really explored too much of the UK, and I'd love to see that. So I already have trips planned to Utah because I've never been to Zion, and I can't wait to go to Zion National Park in Utah.
When you go to these places, do you spend most of your time looking outside at sort of the natural landscapes, or do you spend a lot of time in museums and galleries?
Both. Yeah. It really depends on the place. Like in Utah, it will be a real respite from living in an urban jungle in New York, so I can't wait to be in nature. Also going to Austin, which I've never been, and I want to explore more of this country, of the United States, and see some of the beauty where I live in this country. And I'd love to go to actually where you are, British Columbia. It looks amazing. Banff looks just breathtaking. Depending on where I am, I've always loved nature. I love animals, so being in nature is extremely restorative for me. But I love art, so one of the highlights of being in St. Petersburg, one would think it would be the Hermitage, but actually for me it was the Russian State Museum. The artwork there was just magnificent. It really blew me away. And we went to the Mariinsky Theater, which is incredible, and saw Prince Igor, which is an incredible opera and a ballet, which was also breathtaking. And I love the food. I love trying the different foods wherever I go. I think I'm naturally intrepid, so I think anything new that kind of piques my curiosity inspires me and stimulates me, and that's a wonderful thing about travel.
If you look back, coming from where you were to where you are now, is there anything that remains a challenge, like a big challenge for you in day-to-day life?
I think that given what I've gone through, I have an understanding of human nature. I think that is inclusive of darkness in a way that eludes a lot of people. And so sometimes I think I see things, that are more sinister, that seem benign to others. And so that's challenging. I've actually written about that. And I actually think that's why I work well with people who feel that they haven't been believed, because I'm well aware of what we're capable of as human beings, from the spectrum of our humanity and kindness to our capacity for evil. But that could be a lonely place, and that's a challenging place to hold that.
I know a lot of people who are survivors, they also tend to be very sensitive to the mood states and basically anything that's going on with a person they can feel as soon as they walk in a room.
Yeah.
So I know
the radar is really high.
Mm-hmm. And just sort of that sometimes boundary blurring. I guess for me, that's one thing that I'm still learning, to create a thicker skin so that I'm not bombarded all the time by other people's pain.
Yeah. That's really important. People have the right to also reality test, and you can ask questions. You don't have to assume. Mm-hmm. So sometimes if I sense something but I'm not sure, I'll just ask. And if I trust someone, I have to discern if it's coming from a place where I'm projecting or if it's accurate. And also, hopefully one picks people who are truthful so that you can really gauge what you're picking up.
Would you consider yourself to be a religious person?
No, I'm definitely not a religious person, but I am, however, a spiritual person.
And how would you describe that?
I don't ascribe to dogma or theology, but I do believe in a divine force, and I do believe there is a natural order to things as well as there's chaos. Also, to me, my spiritual path is about principles and ethics. It's about emulating the idea of God as the embodiment of all that is good, all that is love.
What's your political affiliation?
I'm an anarchist. I really don't ascribe to any particular political movement because I really feel at this point everything has become so muddled and we've lost sight of history, and I think that it's very disconcerting to me because I think that what is termed neoliberalism is not what I understand liberalism to be, or moral relativism is a very disturbing concept to me. At this point, I really try to not ascribe to any particular viewpoint.
What's your ancestry? I know you've talked about that a bit, but in terms of both sides of your family?
Both sides were Russian. My grandmother was from Kiev, so actually she was Ukrainian. My grandfather on my father's side was from Georgia, Russia, and my grandmother on my mother's side was Siberian. I'm not sure about my grandfather, but he looked Siberian. They were very fair, full-fledged Russian background.
Do you know of any family that is still in Russia?
I don't. I mean, I think that they came here to escape the pogroms. I did a little bit of research because I want to move to Montreal, so I needed to kind of track down when my grandparents came to Canada. And I may have cousins in Montreal. I mean, that's something I really want to explore, or even throughout Canada. But, it was so long ago that it's difficult to track down the documents, any documentation. Even finding documentation of the ships that were coming in, I had to literally go through a list. It's handwritten, and my mother's birth certificate was handwritten.
What's your most prized possession and why?
Not a very materialistic person. So possession, maybe I have an altar that I created, so it has different things on it that are meaningful to me, little sculptures. I have an affinity for angels for some reason. I always have, and so I have angels all over my house. If I had to say prized possession, I would probably say my altar, because it's a place where I pray and meditate. It's a place where I go that I feel a sense of peace, where I can be silent, where I can connect. So that's a very important, if I can call it a thing.
And would you consider yourself to be an introvert or extrovert?
Probably in between. I enjoy being with others, but I could be very insular. I enjoy my quiet time. I need space to be alone. I have a rich inner life. So I would probably lean more towards introversion. My work obviously necessitates that I have to be in touch with people every day. And also I have pushed myself to do a lot of collective work in the community through my career. That's a tough one.
So probably ambivert.
Ambivert.
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
great.
If you could try any other profession, what would it be?
It would be in the arts, so it would either be as a writer or as an actor. I love acting, but I'm definitely, most actors have stage fright, but I've found that hindered me from really pursuing it. So probably writing. I would just throw myself into it full time. I think I want to move more in the direction of writing creatively. I'm working on a play. I'm actually working on a novel. It's taking forever. That would be the second career.
In one or two words, what's been your theme for 2017?
Thriving and transition into, I think, more creativity. Eventually to moving, definitely feeling a shift.
So what do you think 2018 will look like for you then?
I'm hoping that 2018 is going to be more of solidification of 2017 and really harnessing my creative potentials, moving more in the direction of defining my work in a creative way, and continue to create a life that is, I guess, moving away from so much acute trauma and moving more into the stage of thriving and actualization.
If you had one message for the world, what would it be?
Do the inner work. I think it sounds kind of simplistic, but I think really if we look at the shape of the world, there is so much collective mental illness and complexes. And my message would be, the more integrated, the more in touch with ourselves, the more evolved we are as human beings, the more we contribute to each other.
It's been awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
To learn more about Sheri's work, check out sheritherapist.com. I've included the link and more in this episode's show notes. That concludes our 11th episode of Humans of Earth. Please visit KristenHovet.com for more information and consider becoming a patron of Humans of Earth through Patreon at patreon.com/KristenHovet. A special thank you to our platinum level supporter goes out this week to Stefan of Sport Clips Haircuts of Burbank and the Audi dealership of downtown LA. Thank you for joining me today, and be sure to tune in next time.